I feel called to this thing, but I've also found this other thing that I really, really love. Can the two work together? Am I missing something doing one of them and not doing the other?
Welcome to the In-Between, a space for anyone navigating from the familiar to the unknown. Whether you're facing a personal, professional, or spiritual disruption, these conversations are here to help guide you through the questions, uncertainties, and opportunities that come with change. Hear from leaders, thinkers, and storytellers who found their way forward, and learn how you can too. No matter where you're starting, you don't have to navigate this alone. All right, today I'm thrilled to talk with Michael Whittle, a pastor, entrepreneur, and founder of Pulpit AI. Michael, thanks for being with us. I love what you built. Can you just start out by telling us a little bit more about it?
Yeah, totally. First, Evan, thanks for having me on. It's awesome to chat. We've been internet friends for a while now, so it's good to finally talk in person.
For sure.
But yeah, am a pastor. Started some businesses, and dad. Have two young kids, 3.5-year-old and a 1.5-year-old. And a wife. Today's actually my 9th wedding anniversary, which is kind of cool.
Happy anniversary.
Thank you. So yeah, most recently started a company called Pulpit AI that helps pastors and church teams repurpose sermon content into discipleship material. So that's kind of what, and then am part of a church plant here in Franklin, Tennessee. Moved here from Los Angeles. We were in Los Angeles for 13 years, but about a year ago, moved here to Nashville, like all the other Californians, and are a part of a church plant here in Franklin with some really good friends. So yeah, it's been a fun year.
I love it that you're building tools, but you're still kind of in the trenches of the church world, which I'm sure that like keeps your perspective fresh. But
no matter how many times I try and get away from it, I somehow always end up getting tricked back into it. So, no, kidding.
And I love the tool, man. I even created like a review for it early on and checked it out. I think it's like very powerful, super helpful. For those who might be like unfamiliar, can you kind of share the why? Why did you decide to like build that, create that? What inspired you to pursue that idea?
Yeah, I mean, I think I have always thought that the voice of the average local church pastor should be able to be just as amplified as, the pastor of a church with like a large media team or something like that. We planted a church with some friends in Los Angeles, and, we were just always trying to solve the problem of like, how do we disciple our people, and, pastoring in LA during 2020, predominantly people under the age of 30, was a bit of like a pastoral crisis for me when it was like, I was like, wow, yeah, I mean, anyone who ministered, pastored during that time knows, they know what that was like. But for us, we had this like stark eye-opening of like, wow, our people are being formed and discipled on the internet way more than they are by us. And no matter how well we think we're pastoring them, we could be doing a lot better job. And so it kind of just really came from that. Like, how do we, take a sermon? I've always thought that pastors were like the most underappreciated content creators. It's like probably the only job in the world where you have to come up with something original. Not original, obviously. We don't want to create anything original, but you know what I mean? Like something fresh, right? 50 weeks or 45 weeks a year or whatever. And, yeah, so it was literally just like, how can we take those and use it for every church? How can every church use that to create like homegrown content? So that was kind of the idea. It just happened to be kind of in the middle of the like AI hysteria of, a couple of summers ago. And yeah, that was kind of how it started. So the first thought was, how could we create a very simple tool that took a pastor's sermon and turned it into an email newsletter for their church? That was the first expression of the tool. And I've just kind of always been a tinkerer with technology, and was like, at the time, had a company that was producing about 12 podcast episodes a week. And so we were using AI to super early on to like upload the audio, turn it into show notes and, all that kind of stuff. So I just kind of clicked one day like, oh, let's run a sermon through this and see what happens. So that was honestly it. I love pastors. Most of my best friends were pastors. I know the struggle of a pastor always going like, man, I spend all this time on this sermon. What do I do throughout the rest of the week?
Mm-hmm.
And so that was really it. That was the passion behind it, and then kind of stumbled into it actually becoming a company, which is kind of a funny story in and of itself. But yeah.
Yeah. So how did you validate it? Like, how did you know, like, was it kind of like, I think this is a good idea and we should run with it? Or like, did you have strong evidence like that it could take off? Like, what did that look like?
Yeah. So, I mean, I've tried to start dozens of businesses in my life, and there's always been this, like, will this work or won't it? This was one of those where, like, I just knew if we could get it in front of people and we could convince them to adopt it, that they would use it, just because I understood the problem, right? Having been in ministry for so long. What I didn't anticipate was the conversation around AI, right? And like that sort of, I mean, I'm not that deep of a thinker, but I just didn't think that deeply about the implications around all of it. And so, yeah, we were building an MVP. It was taking way too long, and I'm not a programmer, like I'm not a developer. So I got impatient one day, and I built a landing page on a Friday afternoon, tweeted it out like, hey, we're going to launch this thing. If anybody wants to test it, let me know. Went to bed, woke up the next morning, and it had gone viral on Twitter.
Wow.
So that was kind of the validation, where it was like, I mean, I think we had that first weekend, I think we had almost 600 people signed up on a waiting list to use it.
That's pretty validating.
Yeah. So that was kind of the moment where, in fact, it was so validating for us that I immediately basically just stopped building. I was kind of building like a little podcast network. I pretty much immediately stopped in its tracks and said, we're going to put every ounce of focus we have into building Pulpit AI. So yeah, it was just kind of a bit of a rocket that we luckily had a seat on, I suppose, in those early days.
Love it, man. That's fantastic. So, with you being a pastor, coming from the church space, I think sometimes, and maybe I'm speaking from personal experience, when I look back, I wrestled with tensions about staying rooted in ministry, but also exploring other ideas, other ventures. Why do you think it's possible that pastors may have a hard time like wrestling with that tension?
It's interesting you say that, and I've heard a lot of people talk about that tension. I think, I basically, every pastor that I have, been in their church has always been entrepreneurial. I kind of come from a stream of Christendom, so to speak, where most pastors are just naturally pretty entrepreneurial. So I kind of never knew anything different, like I remember being like newly saved, and, I was born and raised and got saved in Dallas, Texas. So Bishop T.D. Jakes was like the guy, and like even just some of his early, whatever you think about him theologically, but just some of his perspective on ministry and entrepreneurship. So I've actually kind of always seen it done simultaneously. And it's really only been, in the last few years that I've realized, not everybody thinks about this kind of in the way that I've seen it modeled. And so I think I just kind of naturally followed what I saw modeled. That being said, I have had plenty of conversations, where I do see that is a tension that a lot of people face. And it's been a tension that I've faced internally for sure, over the years. But yeah, I think I am a huge believer in pastors doing both as much as they can. Yeah, I could talk about that a lot.
Yeah. Where do you think that, like, any tension that you may have experienced yourself or that you've heard others like verbalize, like, why, like, where does that come from?
For me, it came from, I became a Christian at 13. I got my first prophetic word at 16 that God had called me to ministry. And so there was just always this internal, like, this is what I'm called to do. And if I don't do this in this way, I'm somehow like not following God's call on my life. So for me, it was always kind of like this weird, like internal tension, you know? And then I think also for me, it was like a really practical one, because I was pastoring a church plant in Los Angeles. And so, you know, I had to do stuff on the side in order to make sure the bills were paid, you know? So it's just kind of always been both and. And yeah, I just have always, it's for me, it's always been like an itch that needed to be scratched outside of ministry. But yeah, I do. I think people have this idea, that it's like less holy or something, you know, or hey, this is, or even just like, this is how I'm gifted or whatever. And I think that's a bummer to me, because I think there's a lot of gifting that like if someone is working in ministry, there are so many of those gifts that translate into entrepreneurship that I think oftentimes pastors are actually leaving a lot of opportunity on the table to not capitalize on that.
Hey friends, I want to pause just for a moment. If you're navigating the complex and emotional process of leaving a mission-driven role, whether that's been ministry, nonprofit work, or any purpose-driven career, you're not just looking for a new job. You're wrestling with things like the personal, professional, and spiritual dynamics that come with all of this. Maybe you're asking things like, who am I outside of this role? What skills do I even have that can translate into the future? Will I ever find work that feels meaningful again? If this is resonating, download Finding Your Way to Flourishing. It's a free guide that I've put together for mission-driven leaders who find themselves in the midst of transition. This isn't just another guide, it's a thoughtfully crafted resource that's designed to help you begin processing your identity beyond the role that you're leaving. It can help you pinpoint which skills you can confidently bring into your new and next role. It'll help you lean into your faith and find peace during the midst of this uncertainty. Not overwhelming, it's not complicated. It's just the first step to getting some clarity and moving forward. You don't have to figure this all out alone, and I'd love to walk this journey with you. This guide is completely free, and you can grab your copy today by clicking the link in the description or in the show notes. Let's start making some sense of this transition together. Okay, now back to the conversation.
When I say capitalize, I don't necessarily just mean financially, but also I kind of do mean financially, because the reality is like, well, that gets us into a whole nother conversation about ministry and pay and career and all that kind of stuff. But the reality is most pastors, they're not making a lot of money. And so they kind of have two choices. Do I just kind of keep struggling financially? I know too many pastors, and I've seen too many pastors who are in their 60s and wanting to retire right now, but they can't because they've been faithfully serving God. Amazing. But they've never made any money. And so they're stuck doing what they're doing. You know, I think we're seeing right now in the ministry as a whole, there's this like turnover that's maybe like 10 years too late, but it's because really, if you get below the surface, like a lot of these guys, they can't retire, you know? I'm getting us off on a different track, I tend to ramble. So
no, that's good perspective. And I think it speaks to some of those reasons that, we sometimes wrestle with, well, what if I did pursue this? I lived for a long time with a lot of what if questions, and man, I would rather ask like why not instead of what if.
Totally.
And kind of see what happens. And you know, a few years ago decided to start leaning more into that why not instead of what if. So how have you then, like if those are some of the tensions, how have you like wrestled through that or managed that tension or just overcome some of those mindsets related to that?
Well, I've had, you know, my journey with ministry has been really interesting. I graduated high school early, went to Bible college right out of high school. My first job ever was the janitor at my church. And I mean, I was the guy that was like, I was 16 and all I was ever going to do was ministry. You know, it was like all I ever wanted to do. It was all I ever thought about doing. And when I was, I think I was probably, I think I preached my first sermon at 16. I mean, it was just like, I was at this church where it was like, they saw potential in me and they just gave me a bunch of opportunity, probably way too early, And so the church I was a part of, was just amazing people, all the right intentions. There was some pretty toxic leadership stuff happening there. Church actually no longer exists. It was like a multiple 1,000-member mega church that is actually no longer in existence. And so my first entry to ministry was seeing that, like kind of seeing the inner workings of that. And so at 22, I was like, if this is ministry, I don't want to have anything to do with it. And I quit. And it was in the following years that I stumbled into entrepreneurship. So for me, I've always wrestled with this, like, I feel called to this thing, but I've also found this other thing that I really, really love. Can the two work together? Am I missing something doing one of them and not doing the other? And so my 20s, honestly, from like 25 to, probably 3 years ago, was this like exploration of, can those two coexist? If so, how? What does that look like? What's the balance? And so it's a tension that I still to this day, I battle with. And I think I've kind of, I think in the stream of church that I came up in, we can very much idolize a calling. And I think I realized I was doing that, probably at the age of like 32, 33. I was like, wait a minute, I've like put this thing, like my calling is to just follow this book and to do what God's put in my hand, and whatever that looks like, it looks like. So I would say I have navigated and am still like navigating that,
Yeah.
In fact, I just yesterday texted the pastor of the church who we're planting with, and they've been trying to get me to start teaching semi-regularly. And I've been too busy because of the business. I just haven't had the bandwidth. It's like, there's just way too much going on. I got 2 young kids. And like, finally yesterday, I was like, hey man, happy to jump back in, but like need a lot of heads up and can't do it very often. So I'm still in the middle of like, what does that tension look like? So I don't know if that answers your question.
It does. I mean, because I'm asking partly because, like, one, I want to help those that feel that tension to be willing to step into it and to at least attempt to manage it. Those that are feeling that, are wrestling with that. So that's one reason why. And then it's kind of like two sides to one coin. Two, like, I've always had the kind of thought that, like you said, we make an idol out of calling, and in some ways, the way that we've looked at it, it limits us and keeps us, the way that we've looked at it, keeps us from being a more full expression of who we are, or offering up more of maybe what has been residing in us to share with the world in different ways outside of just this one path or title or role. And so I'm also hearing you say that, there's that calling maybe is more expansive than maybe sometimes how we look at it. Like, is that fair to say? And if so, like, how are you looking at calling nowadays?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do think it's expansive. I think that, one thing that I'm learning right now in every area of my life, and not just in this kind of thought of like career calling, is like, God is he's not like a jigsaw puzzle that we've got to figure out, where we're just kind of like, I've got to, you know what I mean? I think God is sort of like, hey, you're a human. I've given you agency. If you're living a healthy Christian life, it means you have people around you that are speaking into your world, that you're bouncing ideas off of, that are giving you wisdom and counsel. And so to me, calling is like, my calling is to follow Jesus and be who he's called me to be as internally, and be a good husband and a good dad and an actual follower of Jesus. I think pastors, especially entrepreneurial type pastors, it's like my calling is like to build. I'm going to build the church and I'm going to this and that. It's like, I don't know, maybe that's just what you like to do, and that's fine. That's amazing. So I think for me, yeah, I think I'm actually holding calling, that word calling, like so loosely, where it's just like, Lord, I've tried to figure out what that is, and I've tried to manufacture whatever I think that looks like, and it actually never ends up looking like that. So for me, I'm like, I've given up, man. Like I just, even in the last like year and a half, 2 years, we've been through more transition than ever before. And even a year ago, if you were to say, hey, what's life going to look like a year from now? I could never have told you that I would be in the place I'm in right now. So, I don't know, like maybe calling's overrated, I think, in the way that we talk about it and think about it. Yeah, I don't know. Calling.
No,
yeah.
When I think, I've thought about this through the lens of like different people in the Bible, but then when I think about, like, let's just look at your life, for example. So were you living in your calling when you were 16 and decided to start like going to church, or when you were the janitor, or when you decided to start like a podcasting agency, when you were participating in the church plan? At what point were you like in your calling? Or was your calling like expanding? Like, are you in your calling now? Like,
Totally.
yes, it's just like growing and growing and growing. But if we were to just look at calling as, well, no, I'm in this place and it means that I'm doing this thing, gosh, you might still be, and there's nothing wrong with being a janitor or doing what you're doing now, but you might still be the janitor.
Totally.
You know what I mean? So it's
100%.
like,
and I think, I think I do think there are moments and seasons in life where God breathes on something, or we get and like, I'm a believer in all of that. In fact, in the last 2 months, there have been things that have happened in my life that were like prophetic words given to me a decade ago, that if you would have told me this is actually how that would come to pass, I never would have told you this would have been the journey to get there. Like, never. And so I think, yeah, it's like, is it expanding? Yeah. Was I in it then or now? I have no idea. And it's like, I just kind of go, God, I am again continuing to go, God, I don't bend your will to me. I bend to your will. And that is what the life of a Christian looks like in ministry or in business, right? And so, yeah, I do. I think becoming a Christian and sort of like, actually in the year 2000 and coming up in that like youth camps and conferences, and God's got a big call on your life, and you're going to do this and you're going to do that. And in fact, Andy Squires, who's a writer that I really, really like, did a post on Instagram on this. Probably I can send it to you. Maybe a couple of years ago, where he sort of like talked about this like cultural thing that was happening back when I was a teenager, which was like, you go to a big camp and you get this big prophetic word, and you're going to go to the nations, and you're going to this and you're going to that. And then like fast forward 15 years and you're living in the suburbs selling insurance, and you're going, oh God, you failed me, or like you didn't come through. And his whole thing is like, yeah, maybe some of that stuff maybe we were idolizing some of that stuff a bit, And so what happens 10, 15 years down the road when we look around and go, wait a minute, I didn't ever do the big thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't know. I'm really on this journey of like, I don't know, calling is like, I don't know, God, what do you have in front of me, and who am I becoming? Like way more than what am I doing? Because I don't know about you, but what I've done has changed dozens of times.
Absolutely.
So
yeah,
that's kind of how I'm thinking about it these days anyway.
I love that. Yeah, either God failed us or we failed God, and I don't know if either one of those is fair necessarily.
Exactly.
Like, especially in some of the environments that you were just describing. So what role has curiosity played in your life?
Pretty much that is the connective tissue for me. I am a highly curious person. Gosh, if someone were to, I don't know, spend a week like watching how productive. I am curious. I spend a lot of time reading. I spend a lot of time kind of like poking around the internet, poking around like what's happening, what is there to learn. Like to me, that's everything. I get that. My grandfather, who I spent a lot of time with growing up, was highly curious. He was an avid reader. He was one of those guys who just like wanted to know a bit about everything. And so for me, that's just kind of always been my natural tendency. And I think probably in my mid-20s, until my mid-20s, I always thought that was like a bad thing, you know? And the older I get, the more I'm like, I'm just going to go with it. I'm going to kind of be a bit all over the place. I'm going to probably spend a lot more time kind of like meandering around and reading and thinking than I am like responding to emails. It's just like but everything I've ever done that was fulfilling to me was the result of like kind of stumbling into something that I was curious about. And so it may always not be efficient, at least for me anyways. In fact, it's been the opposite of that. But yeah, the smartest people I've ever been around, the successful people, they're curious. You know, it's like that age-old thing. Like, you know, the people that I've always looked up to, that I've ever had a chance to be around, they ask way more questions than they do give answers. And so, yeah, to me, it's been a huge piece of kind of everything in my life, for sure.
So that might be one way to become or practice more curiosity. So I'm wondering though, like, if someone wanted to be a more curious person or give more thought to some of those ideas that have been bouncing around in their head, any handles, any suggests for like, well, if you want to be more curious, like try this or do this or practice this.
I've often like wondered that. Like, I don't know if everyone, like sometimes, I don't know about you, it's like sometimes I wish I wasn't curious. Like sometimes I wish I didn't, like, because it feels like life would actually be like a bit more predictable, you know? So I think like if you're not, I don't think that's, you know, but I think you kind of just have to go down that road. So much of it to me is way more art than science, you know? It's like, what is interesting to me? Why do I find that interesting? What is it about that I find interesting? And that's just, you kind of just have to follow the rabbit hole a little bit. And I think a lot of times we don't like that time. We see it as inefficiency. It's not inefficient. You know, it's like, dude, don't respond to the email for an hour. Like, just give it a break. Go read some. We have the internet, which is just like you can learn anything you want. Like, nobody has an excuse to not learn about anything that they want to learn about. And so to me, it's like, just make time for it. And as you're like, yeah, whether it's a business idea, whether it's like whatever it is, just go down that road, and you're not wasting time. Or maybe you are, but who cares?
Yeah.
You know, like that. I think that's how I think about it, at least.
So as you're getting curious and as you've been entrepreneurial, and I'm sure like have even more ideas in your head maybe now, like at what point or how have you decided like, okay, I've been curious about this long enough, and maybe I've been curious about these 5, 10, 15 different things, but this is going to be the one or two that I'm going to invest more time in. Like, how have you like discerned or figured out which curiosities to like lean further into?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think some curiosities are meant to just be that for enjoyment, right? I think when you're talking about business, the reality is like, and I've learned this the hard way, it's like, just because you're curious about something doesn't mean it's a good idea for a business, right? So I think you almost have to kind of like separate that. It's like, man, I'm really curious. I love writing. In my young 20s, I was really into filmmaking, wrote screenplays. Like, I love that, right? I've spent time doing it. I've never done it, though, as like, this is how I'm going to make my money in a career. Does that make sense? So I think you just have to kind of go like, where is this leading me? You know, what are you, it's almost like you got to be like curious, but also pragmatic. You know what I mean? Like, hey, I have this business idea that's like, I'm really curious about, but is it a good idea? and can you build a sustainable business around it, right? So I just think you've got to be super intellectually honest with yourself about like what brought you down that road and what are you wanting to get out of it. Because if someone's like, oh, I'm curious in entrepreneurship, well, then it's like, cool, well then, be curious, but then also realize there's this pragmatic nature of like, you start a business to make money from it, right? Like that's what entrepreneurship ultimately leads to, and not in like a ultra capitalistic way, but like, it's a business is designed to make money, right? So I think it's just kind of sorting through all that, like curiosity. I'm really curious about like an example. Like I find really interesting, like I like weird, interesting people, and I'm curious. Like I find kind of like unique people who are doing really unique stuff, who maybe kind of. I find them really curious. I'm really curious about that, And so, but I don't learn about them, or I don't to like. I don't feel like I'm making sense, but I think you get what I'm saying. It's like there's got to be an outcome. What's the outcome? And determining what that is. Is it just for enjoyment? Is it just because like, or is it, hey, I want to start this kind of company, so I'm going to be really curious and I'm going to study and learn, and then. Ultimately, it's going to come down to, can this become what I want it to become? Yeah. So I think it's just determining what you want the outcome to be.
Yeah. And even just putting thought towards, like you're saying, those two categories, I think that's helpful. Like which ones are enjoyment and which ones actually have potential viability based on market need, based on my own abilities, skill sets, all of that could potentially be entrepreneurial. I mean, just even beginning to categorize or separate those into those two buckets could help people start to like distinguish some of that. So did you ever have doubts about the viability of Pulpit AI, or like, I mean, you started out with a strong wait list, but any doubts about it as it was growing or building?
I never had doubts about, and again, this goes back to, if you want to be an entrepreneur, think of something you're an expert in. And if you experience that problem, likely other people have that. So I grew up in church, been in church my whole life, done ministry. So I didn't ever question the viability of like, is this a problem that needed to be solved? I knew it. I just knew like people will jump on this. The more the viability that I questioned was, could we do it better than anyone else? Like, could we provide the solution that's better? Or with sort of the world of AI and how many things are always changing, right? Like, is this a viable business at this size, or this size, right? So can I outcompete this person that's doing the same thing or this person that's doing the same thing? So I never questioned the viability of, do people need this and will people pay for it? Because like you said, there was just so much demand right off the bat. It was more like the viability of my own execution, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And even going, like, I don't think I've ever had a business. I don't think I've ever done anything that I felt I am more suited to do that. Like, this is perfect. Like, this is like perfect for me, just the mixture of all the things that I know about and like and love. But I still, the validity was more like, can I be the person to execute this successfully? So I would say that was the piece of it. Yeah. How did you
like work through those doubts or live with those doubts and keep executing?
I think I lived with them. I still live with them. I think it's what makes us sharp and humble. Again, in business, you are always taking in data points, right? It's everything in business is a calculated bet. I'm a poker player. I love poker. And so, you are just always thinking through all of those things, and that could change every day. I will say nothing like having your own business, like it is a roller coaster. And so like you see these memes online, right? Of like, there is no middle ground. You're either like confident this thing is going to be the next Facebook, or I'm going to be broke, I'm going to embarrass myself, and this is going to be the worst thing ever. Like, that is real, And I think that's just part of the entrepreneurial journey that like will never go away. I mean, it's so hard, and so I think you just kind of live with it. And I think in this case for me, and I generally don't over spiritualize stuff, so I don't know that this works for everyone in every situation, but it did feel like this thing specifically was just something that God had ordained. Like, there's no other way. I mean, it grew in spite of me. Like I say, personally, we had our second kid. Our daughter was born a month after we launched Pulpit AI. She had to have like life-saving surgery on day 3. She's great now. We moved to Nashville. My wife lost her job. Our kid had to have emergency follow-up surgery. So like, if you were to say like, what have you experienced the last year and a half? Like, Pulpit AI has done what it's done in many ways despite me, honestly, and like despite my ability to make the thing happen. And so I do think there are just certain moments where like God's grace is on something, or you feel like it's on you for a specific season doing a specific thing. And so honestly, man, like I had to really lean into that. I don't mean to over spiritualize it, but for me, it has literally been like I know you did ministry, like there are moments where like you're just like, God, this is your ministry. Like, I didn't ask for this. So like, and I felt like I did that with the business, It's that 2 Timothy 2:1, Paul says, Timothy, be strong in the grace that's in Christ Jesus, which is sort of like, Timothy, you didn't ask to be here. So like, I'll fight this battle for you. And so I think that's the only way for me. Like, I would say, that's the beautiful thing about being a Christian and an entrepreneur, is that he's with us in that, and I think it's easy to separate, but I've just learned like the only way to make it through is to not separate the two, if that makes sense. At least that's what's been really helpful for me.
Yeah, no, that I appreciate that, man. That's beautiful. Why would you want to separate the two? Mm-hmm. So you, like this past year and a half and even existing, how do you think, or pre-existing, how do you think transitions shape or refine? How has your sense of purpose been refined or shaped over this past year and a half? Or if you think about other transitions in your life?
I genuinely believe a transition, like an external transition, is the perfect opportunity for like some of our deepest internal transitions. I know for me in my life, when I've experienced external transition, there's actually always something that God's been doing inside of me that's actually even more important than the external transition. I think that pastorally, what I have seen is I have seen people make some of the most destructive decisions in the middle of transition, right? There's something to transitions that are like, they feel high stakes. And I actually think they are high stakes, because I think that, again, God's always trying to do something in us before he's doing anything externally, right? So what was the question? How have I navigated? Sorry.
So how have they helped refine or shape your sense of purpose as you're in the middle of them or coming out of them? Like, as you reflect back, how did they shape or refine you?
For me, it's always been an identity thing, man. It's always gone back to, who am I? Who am I trying to impress? What am I trying to prove? We all have these things inside of us that are there, right? From childhood or from whatever. This time for me, it has been very much like, this last transition has very, very much been like, not to sound super like psychoanalytical, but like very much like ways that I've been and thought since I was a kid, and where did those come from, and how have those, it's like God is pulling stuff out based upon it. A lot of it has been like bad theology, ways in which that I was thinking about God that I shouldn't be thinking about God, or ways, all that kind of stuff. So I think for me, there has always been like, on the other side of transition, there's like the practical change, but for me, those have always been seasons of like massive internal change, and so I think that like we're missing what God wants to say to us about identity and control and idolatry and all of these things that start to build up that we don't necessarily realize in a moment of transition. And then I just think too, like, making massive decisions in the middle of a transition is probably not the best, idea, because I think it's like, let's let the dust settle a bit and kind of go from there. I think during transition, we're not always at our sharpest, because again, there is so much about transition that leads to identity and who am I and what's next. And so for me, transition has always represented something deeply in me that God was kind of putting his finger on and just going, hey, let's kind of get underneath that a little bit and reorient it. So
yeah, how are there questions that you're asking, or is there things that you're practicing in those moments? I guess I'm asking, are these things that you've realized after the fact? Are there intentional things that you were asking or practicing in the midst of that to help pinpoint or understand some of those things?
No, I think I had to kind of do the work to figure that out. I mean, for me, it's been, I got a guy who's a mentor and a pastor to me who's, got his doctorate in psychology, but also his doctorate in theology. And so he's really it's just, I think again, it's that time to dig in and go, let me ask the questions. Let me bring to speech, right? That's what prayer is. Prayer is like bringing to speech things that are deep inside of us and kind of like letting them just sit out there. And so for me, there's been questions and frustrations and, oh, wow, I didn't realize I'd always expected God to do X, Y, Z. And I'm actually, you know what I mean? So I think it's it's just getting brutally honest with God. And then practically as well, like where am I at, asking those questions and then just doing the work to move forward. So I think to me, transition, I'm just a big believer in who do you have around you that you're talking to about stuff, who can help make sense of this kind of stuff, who has insights and giftings and can speak to my blind spots and can kind of help me understand and see things from a different perspective. Right. And so I've just found having people I have people that I just talk to and can get super vulnerable with and help me make sense of stuff and help me see what I'm seeing wrong or see things that I'm not seeing. Right. So, I think it's really hard to do alone. I think people are everything. That's that's kind of a big part of what we believe. Right. So I would just say the first thing is don't do it alone. And then, I would just say that. I would say I've just been super grateful for people that I've been able to just go help.
I think you are absolutely right about that. I have friendships in small circles where those types of conversations can happen. There were also things in my life that I had to untangle and unravel over these past few years that a counselor helped with. I also participated with a coach for one particular season, and I realized those are benefits and not everyone may be able to afford that or whatever the case may be, different circumstances. However, it's also worth looking at it as an investment and not a cost.
100. I cannot agree with you more on that.
I mean, it can literally save you years. And you've already been carrying it for years. Why not take 6 months or 1 year to stop to accelerate the process and the change?
100%. I agree with you. Coaches, therapists, you name it. I 100%. 100%.
Either way though, there are certain things there has to be outside perspective, outside voices, people who can share a different point of view that you probably have not yet been able to see or look at it that way. And when you start to get that, you really can start to unravel knots and connect dots.
That's so true.
Yeah. Couple more questions for you, Michael. What advice, what encouragement would you give to someone who maybe feels drawn to something new, but they're afraid to take that first step?
I think it's I think it's asking the questions. It's funny that you mentioned the like untangle piece. And it's interesting because what I'm realizing is some of the things we're drawn to and some of the things we're drawn away from are very much in relation to some of those tangles, right? And so I think one of the things you want to do is go, where's this coming from, right? Like why am I being drawn to this thing, or why am I being drawn away from this thing? And having that intellectually honest conversation with yourself, right? An example of that is before COVID, my wife and I were pastoring in LA. We were pastoring a location of a church that we absolutely loved. And I started feeling this like, where do I want to plant a church? This thing in me. It was like this unrest. And it was like, and for a year it was like, we're going to do this thing. And it was like, I would have told you that I think God was stirring me to go do something, right? Thank God COVID hit and everything slowed down and I could untangle some stuff and go, hey God, okay, so I think it's actually about this and actually about this and actually about this. So let's like rethink it. So I think the number one thing you want to do is find out why to the best of your ability. And then I think if it's something small, I want to try and start a business, or I want to, I would say you just got to take like little tiny steps to try that, like what are like those small steps that you can take to kind of move in that direction. If it's a big transition or a big change, I would say that's when you bring on someone to help you kind of walk through that. I am just a firm believer in the wisdom of many counselors. I probably have more people that I get, I probably talk to more people than I should, because sometimes it can even confuse me. But I just think like, that's a huge thing is, hey, help me see this clearly. Because I think that's what the body of Christ is for. It's what therapists and coaches, and like you said, there's a few different ways to look at that. But yeah, I think if you're feeling it, it's like, why am I feeling it? What are some tiny steps that I can take, or what are some conversations that I can have, or, but I think what you said, I keep coming back to what you said about that being get untangled thing, because I think we are so unaware of sometimes why we desire what we desire. And it's really good to try and put a finger on that first.
Yes.
So I know that's not super practical.
No, it is.
But humans make some weird decisions, man. And on the surface, and it's like, so I think for me, I'm 39 almost. So I'm not old by any means, but I just like move slowly when it comes to transitions. Like, yeah, I don't know. I think I'm getting slower and more careful and more thoughtful. Maybe like having kids has something to do with it. I don't know. When I was younger, it's totally different. If you're 24 and you are newly married and you have no responsibility, just go start the business. Just do it.
Just do it.
Because you know what I'm saying? So I think that's the whole thing too. It's like, where are you at? What season are you in? What are your priorities? I think you got to like figure that out first.
I mean, to summarize, like, you got to start asking questions.
Yes.
You have to start asking questions. Okay.
That's so true.
One last question. What does flourishing mean to you nowadays?
So this is going to be a bit idiosyncratic. This is going to be a bit like not super practical, but to me, flourishing, I have this like picture. This is like new thing that my wife and I have started. We both come from divorced homes and homes where there is no longer like a centralized home, if that makes sense, And so for me, like flourishing is like when I'm 65, like we're the place our kids want to come back home to for the holidays. Do our kids want to be around us? Do our people? So that's like long term, and that's obviously coming out of our own personal life and stuff and desire, right? So I think like, again, I'm like 2 young kids. I just sold a company. Like I'm being so reflective about everything right now, right? Just because that's the season of life that I'm finding myself in. But yeah, so much of it is that. It's like, I don't know, does my wife still love me and want to be around me? And do my kids look at me with respect? And want to come to me for wisdom and insight, right? Like those are some of the things that I think flourishing looks like. I think flourishing looks like having people in your life that can hold you accountable, that can, it's like I say all the time, like God has really blessed me with some amazing brothers to like walk this life with who are Christians. And we always talk about like, dude, if I started being stupid, they'd be all over me. You know what I mean? And so I think like flourishing, again, it's so like typical, but it's like, it's relationship. It's peace. And I do think there is something to flourishing is like, if we want to get practical, it's doing something that you love to do most of the time. It's finding fulfillment in where you spend your time and how you spend it and all that kind of stuff. So, yeah, I don't know if that's a good answer or not, but right now I'm kind of just in that answer. Like, flourishing to me is not self-destructing in my 60s and finishing in a healthy way. And yeah, I don't know. It's just kind of where I'm at right now.
I love it.
So,
I think that's
but I also
great.
wouldn't mind, a bunch of money in the bank and selling a company for a whole bunch of money and, all the practical stuff too. But that's, I don't know. I think all that comes and goes. I've seen enough people who've been successful that aren't flourishing.
Sure.
So, anyways, I don't know if that answers your question, but
hey,
where I'm
it
at.
answers the question from your perspective, and so I appreciate that and I love it. So thank you.
Amazing. Sure.
Where can people connect with you? Where can they learn more about what you're doing and the great work that's happening?
Oh, thanks, man. I spend way too much time on Twitter, X.
Fun follow. He is a fun follow on X. Just let you know.
I'm at Michael Whittle. I do like to have fun. That's pretty much it, man. On Instagram, I pretty much talk about the stuff that I love, and it's pretty easy to kind of find whatever's happening through following me on there. So
great, man. Appreciate you, Michael. Anything you want to say about Pulpit AI? Anywhere to look for that? Or
yeah, you can go to pulpitai.com and sign up. Again, we just really are about the local church, and we love pastors, and we want to help you disciple your people. So, yeah, pulpitai.com. Hopefully soon to be pulpit.ai. We're working on it.
Okay.
But we'll see. So for now, it's pulpitai.com.
Cool. It's a great tool. I love it.
Thanks, Evan.
Michael, thanks again for being on here and for having the conversation.
Absolutely, man. Thanks for having me.